June 22, 1941. 3:15 in the morning. Along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory. The largest invasion in human history had begun, and Joseph Stalin, the man who had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler less than 2 years earlier, refused to believe it was happening. Reports flooded into Moscow. German bombers struck Soviet airfields. Panzer divisions smashed through border defenses. Artillery barrages lit up the dawn sky across 1,000 miles of frontier. Stalin's generals begged for permission to respond. He ordered them to wait. This had to be a provocation, he insisted. Some rogue German commanders acting without Hitler's knowledge. Any moment now, Berlin would apologize and pull back its troops. It took him nearly 12 hours to accept the truth. By then, the Luftwaffe had destroyed over 1,000 Soviet aircraft, most of them on the ground. German tanks were already 30 miles into Soviet territory. The Red Army, caught completely unprepared, was reeling backward in chaos. 6,000 miles away in Washington, Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat in the Oval Office and considered what to say about it. The news had reached him early that morning. He'd spent the day in meetings, reading intelligence reports, taking phone calls from his military advisors. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. What would America do? Would Roosevelt help Stalin? Could he help Stalin? Should he help Stalin? These were not simple questions. Roosevelt had spent the last year and a half carefully, methodically building support for helping Britain fight Nazi Germany. He'd pushed the Lend-Lease Act through Congress just 3 months earlier, allowing him to send weapons and supplies to any nation whose defense he deemed vital to American security. But that had been a brutal political fight. Isolationists in Congress had screamed that he was dragging America toward war. Public opinion remained divided. Many Americans wanted nothing to do with Europe's conflicts. And now Hitler had attacked the Soviet Union, Stalin's Soviet Union, communist Russia, the nation that millions of Americans viewed with deep suspicion and hostility, the regime that had signed a pact with Hitler in 1939, that had invaded Poland from the east while Germany invaded from the west, that had swallowed the Baltic states and attacked Finland. Roosevelt knew what his political opponents would say if he rushed to Stalin's aid. They would call him a communist sympathizer. They would say he was choosing between two monsters. They would use it to attack everything he'd built. But Roosevelt also understood something else, something that transcended ideology and political calculation. If Hitler conquered the Soviet Union, if the Nazi war machine gained control of Soviet resources and territory, if Germany no longer had to fight on 2 fronts, then Britain would fall. And if Britain fell, America would face Nazi Germany alone, across an ocean that would no longer protect it. The question wasn't whether to help the Soviet Union. The question was how to do it without destroying his ability to help at all. In London, Winston Churchill had no such constraints. On the evening of the invasion, just 9 hours after German troops crossed the border, he sat before a BBC microphone and delivered one of the most remarkable speeches of the war. His voice, gravelly and defiant, crackled across the airwaves to millions of listeners. "The Nazi regime is indistinguishable from the worst features of communism," he said. "No one has been a more consistent opponent of communism than I have for the last 25 years. I will unsay no word that I have spoken about it." He paused, letting that sink in. Then came the pivot. "But all this fades away before the spectacle which is now unfolding. The past, with its crimes, its follies, and its tragedies, flashes away. I see the Russian soldiers standing on the threshold of their native land, guarding the fields which their fathers have tilled from time immemorial. I see them guarding their homes where mothers and wives pray. I see the 10,000 villages of Russia where the means of existence is wrung so hardly from the soil, but where there are still primordial human joys, where maidens laugh and children play." His voice rose. I see advancing upon all this in hideous onslaught the Nazi war machine, with its clanking, heel-clicking, dandified Prussian officers, its crafty expert agents fresh from the cowing and tying down of a dozen countries. I see also the dull, drilled, docile, brutish masses of the Hun soldiery, plodding on like a swarm of crawling locusts. Then came the line that would define his position. Any man or state who fights against Nazism will have our aid. Any man or state who marches with Hitler is our foe. If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. It was bold. It was clear. It was everything Roosevelt could not afford to be. Roosevelt's press conference came 2 days later, on June 24. Reporters packed into his office, notebooks ready, questions prepared. Everyone knew what they wanted to ask. Would America help Russia? Would Lend-Lease be extended to the Soviets? What did the president think about this new development in the war? Roosevelt sat behind his desk, cigarette holder tilted at its characteristic angle, and began to speak. His words were careful, measured, deliberately vague. "Of course, we are going to give all the aid we possibly can to Russia," he said. But then came the qualifications, the hedges, the political cover. He wouldn't invoke the Neutrality Act against the Soviet Union, he explained. That meant American ships could carry supplies to Soviet ports, but he stopped short of promising specific aid. He talked about the need to assess what the Soviets actually needed. He emphasized that any help to Russia would ultimately help American defense by keeping Hitler occupied. It was not Churchill's ringing declaration. It was not a dramatic commitment. To many listeners, it sounded almost disappointing. But Roosevelt understood something the reporters didn't. He wasn't making policy in that press conference. He was buying time. Behind the scenes, he was already moving. The day after the invasion, he'd ordered his staff to begin compiling lists of supplies that could be sent to the Soviet Union. He'd contacted his advisors about the legal mechanisms for extending Lend-Lease. He'd begun the delicate work of building political support for a policy that many Americans would find unpalatable. But first, he needed information. He needed to know if the Soviet Union could actually survive. Many military experts were predicting Soviet collapse within weeks. The German army had crushed Poland in a month, France in 6 weeks. The Red Army, purged of much of its officer corps by Stalin's paranoia in the late 1930s, appeared disorganized and demoralized. If the Soviets were going to fold quickly anyway, there was no point in spending political capital to help them. Roosevelt needed someone he trusted to go to Moscow, assess the situation, and report back. He chose Harry Hopkins. Hopkins was an unlikely envoy. Thin to the point of frailty, frequently ill, he had no official position in the government. But he was Roosevelt's closest advisor, the man the president trusted more than anyone else. He lived in the White House, he had Roosevelt's complete confidence, and he had a gift for cutting through diplomatic niceties to understand what was really happening. In mid-July, Hopkins flew to Moscow via Scotland and Archangel. The journey took days. When he arrived, Soviet officials whisked him immediately to meet Stalin. The meeting took place in the Kremlin, in Stalin's office. Hopkins, exhausted from travel, sat across from the Soviet dictator and asked him directly what the Soviet Union needed and whether it could hold out against the German assault. Stalin was blunt. He needed anti-aircraft guns. He needed aluminum for building aircraft. He needed machine tools. He needed trucks. The list went on. But more than the specific requests, Hopkins came away with something else, a sense that Stalin was determined to fight, that the Soviet Union, despite the catastrophic losses of the first weeks, was not going to collapse. Stalin told Hopkins that the Red Army would hold the Germans at least until winter, that the Soviet Union had moved its industrial capacity eastward beyond the reach of German bombers, that the Russian people would fight for their homeland in ways the Germans couldn't anticipate. Hopkins, skeptical by nature, found himself believing it. He flew back to Washington and told Roosevelt what he'd learned. The Soviets could fight. They would fight, but they needed help, and they needed it soon. Roosevelt began the process of extending Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union. It was not a simple matter. Congress would have to be convinced, public opinion would have to be managed, the legal framework would have to be established, and all of it would have to be done while maintaining the fiction that America was still neutral, still not at war. Throughout the summer and fall of 1941, Roosevelt worked the problem. He gave speeches emphasizing the Nazi threat. He framed aid to the Soviet Union not as support for communism, but as defense of American interests. He pointed out, again and again, that every German soldier fighting in Russia was a German soldier not fighting elsewhere. Every German tank destroyed on the Eastern Front was a tank that would never threaten Britain or America. It was not inspiring rhetoric. It was not Churchill's poetry. But it was effective. Slowly, reluctantly, American public opinion began to shift. Not toward enthusiasm for Stalin, but toward acceptance that helping the Soviet Union served American purposes. The formal extension of Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union came on November 7, 1941. Exactly 1 month before Pearl Harbor. By then, the German advance had stalled outside Moscow. The easy victory Hitler had expected had turned into a grinding war of attrition. Soviet resistance had proven far stronger than anyone anticipated, and American aid, though still limited, was beginning to flow. Roosevelt's cautious approach had worked. He'd managed to help the Soviet Union without triggering the political backlash that could have destroyed his ability to help anyone. He'd bought time for Stalin to organize his defenses. He'd kept Hitler fighting on 2 fronts, and he'd done it all while maintaining enough political support to continue building American military strength. But the caution had come at a cost. In those first crucial weeks after the invasion, when the Red Army was reeling and desperate, American aid had been minimal, symbolic rather than substantial. Roosevelt's political calculations, necessary as they were, had meant that Soviet soldiers fought with less support than they might have had. It's impossible to know what would have happened if Roosevelt had responded like Churchill. If he'd gone on the radio the day after the invasion and declared full support for the Soviet Union. Would the political backlash have been as severe as he feared? Would it have crippled his ability to prepare America for war? Or would bold leadership have rallied the country behind him? These are questions without answers. What we know is what actually happened. Roosevelt chose the path of careful calculation over dramatic gesture. He said what he needed to say to keep his options open. He moved behind the scenes while speaking cautiously in public. He treated Stalin's crisis as a problem to be managed rather than a cause to be championed. And in doing so, he revealed something fundamental about his leadership style and his understanding of American politics. Roosevelt knew that he could not lead where the country would not follow. He knew that his power to help anyone, Britain or Russia or anyone else, depended on maintaining enough political support to keep acting. He knew that one dramatic gesture could destroy everything he'd built. So when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, when Churchill made his famous speech about making pacts with the devil, when reporters asked Roosevelt what he thought, the President of the United States gave them careful words about American interests and strategic necessities. He gave them bureaucratic language about assessing needs and determining procedures. He gave them everything except the ringing declaration they wanted. Because Roosevelt understood that in the summer of 1941, America was not ready for ringing declarations. The country was not prepared for war. Public opinion remained divided. Isolationism remained strong. And the president's job was not to make speeches that would feel good in the moment, but to make decisions that would matter in the long run. The contrast between Churchill and Roosevelt in those June days reveals something about both men. Churchill could afford to be bold because Britain was already at war, already committed, already fighting for its survival. He had nothing left to lose by declaring his support for Stalin. His political position was secure precisely because the situation was desperate. Roosevelt's position was different. America was not at war. It was not directly threatened. It still had choices to make about its level of involvement, and Roosevelt knew that if he moved too fast, if he pushed too hard, he could trigger a political reaction that would paralyze him entirely. So he moved slowly, carefully, testing each step before taking the next, building support gradually rather than demanding it immediately, working behind the scenes while speaking cautiously in public. It was not the leadership style that makes for inspiring stories. There was no dramatic moment when Roosevelt stood before the nation and declared his intentions. No speech that historians would quote for generations. Just a series of careful decisions, bureaucratic maneuvers, and political calculations. But those careful decisions mattered. By November 1941, American aid was flowing to the Soviet Union. By the time America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the framework for massive support to Stalin was already in place. The political groundwork had been laid. The bureaucratic mechanisms had been established. The public had been prepared, and on the Eastern Front, the Red Army was still fighting, still holding, still buying time for the rest of the world to mobilize against Hitler. Roosevelt's response to Operation Barbarossa was not what people wanted to hear in June 1941. It was not bold or inspiring or clear, but it was what the situation required, and in the end, it achieved what it needed to achieve. The president said what he needed to say to keep America moving toward war without moving so fast that the country would refuse to follow. He helped Stalin without embracing Stalin. He opposed Hitler without declaring war on Hitler. He threaded a needle that many people thought was impossible to thread. And when people asked him what he thought about Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, when they wanted to know where America stood, Roosevelt gave them the truth. Not the dramatic truth they wanted, but the practical truth they needed. America would help. Eventually, when it could, in ways that served American interests, through mechanisms that could survive political scrutiny, with an eye toward the long game rather than the immediate crisis. It was not poetry, but it was policy. And in the summer of 1941, policy was what mattered. The question of whether Roosevelt made the right choice remains debatable. Some historians argue he should have moved faster, that his caution cost Soviet lives and prolonged the war. Others argue he moved as fast as politically possible, that any bolder action would have backfired. What's clear is that Roosevelt made a choice. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, when the world's attention turned to the Eastern Front, when everyone waited to hear what America would do, Roosevelt chose calculation over declaration. He chose to preserve his political capital rather than spend it on a dramatic gesture. He chose the long game over the short, and he did it knowing that people would criticize him for it, knowing that Churchill's speech would be remembered while his press conference would be forgotten, knowing that history might judge his caution harshly. But Roosevelt was not playing for history's judgment in June 1941. He was playing to keep America moving toward a war it was not yet ready to fight, to build support for policies the country was not yet ready to accept, to help allies the American people were not yet ready to embrace. So when people asked what he said when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, the answer is simple. He said what he needed to say. Nothing more, nothing less. Just enough to keep moving forward without moving so fast that he'd lose the ability to move at all. It wasn't the speech anyone wanted, but it might have been exactly the speech America needed.